Okay, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, so how's everyone doing today?
Good.
Good. Okay, cool. So I'm really excited to be here. As you can probably imagine, I've given numerous talks on Islamophobia. Unfortunately, it seems like it's going to be a continuing problem for years to come. It has been for decades. So it's really great to, work with other groups to really deal with this phenomenon of Islamophobia. So as Liana mentioned, I did do my dissertation. I finished a couple years ago from American University. The title of my dissertation was Too Damn Muslim to Be Trusted, the War on Terror and the Muslim American Response. Now, okay, so the title of my dissertation was Too Damn Muslim to Be Trusted, the War on Terror and the Muslim American Response. So let me explain to you what the title was about. As part of my dissertation, I interviewed about 75 Muslim Americans to get their perceptions on the war on terror, whether or not they felt that they had been targeted, how the policies of the war on terror had impacted their political participation, their citizenship. And so one of the participants that I was speaking to was referring to the attack in Norway a couple years ago by Anders Breivik. And she was talking about how the media presented the story and largely what sort of the reaction to that story was. Namely that he had a mental health condition, that he wasn't treated as a terrorist. At the same time, had that person, as we know, been a Muslim, the reaction would have been much different, right? And so she said, we're essentially too damn Muslim to be trusted. So that kind of feeds into the way I'm going to talk about Islamophobia. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what I consider this phenomenon to be, how I think it's articulated. But I think one of the core ideas in this notion of Islamophobia is the idea of social construction and the ways in which Muslims have been constructed and the ways that these constructions enter into the policy sphere. So what does it mean when we consider Muslims to be terrorists? What does it mean when we think of Islam as being uncivilized or barbaric? What does it mean when we think of Islam as being inherently opposed to the West? It has implications in terms of the sort of treatment that then appears to be justified in the realm of policy. So when we think about Islamophobia, though, as a system of oppression, as any system of oppression, there are three ways it's manifested: on the interpersonal level or societal level, on the institutional level, and on the internalized level. Now, for the purposes of this audience, I'm obviously going to focus on interpersonal and institutional, because internalized really is a discussion that would be had with Muslims who may have sort of internalized some of the ways in which Muslims have been oppressed and take that internally and sort of use that in their advocacy efforts, whether intentionally or not. So in developing this concept of institutional Islamophobia, what I usually like to do is to start out with a couple of quotes from both past presidents and President Trump as well. So previously, at the onset sort of the war on terror, President Bush stated that our war is not against Islam or against faith practiced by the Muslim people. Our war is a war against evil. Then in 2015, President Obama said, no one in the United States of America should ever be targeted because of who they are, what they look like, or how they worship. Earlier this year, Trump was interviewed and said, Islam hates us. Okay. So if we look at sort of this trajectory, we might be fooled into thinking that the war on terror is something that just began when Trump became president. That Trump is not building off a legacy of destructive and problematic policies targeting and criminalizing Muslims. And the reason I like to mention the two quotes by President Obama and President Bush is because, despite their rhetoric, the policies of the war on terror have very much been and almost exclusively focused on Muslims as terrorists. So it's important to keep this in mind when we reflect not only on what President Trump has been active in doing in perpetuating the war on terror, but again, what the legacy is that he's building off of. And we need to be critical, because this is not just about fighting Islamophobia under Trump. This is about fighting Islamophobia under a US government that has shown that they are determined to target and criminalize Muslims. So when we think about Islamophobia on an institutional level, right, How is that manifested? Well, there's numerous policies and laws, and this could go on and on and on. But for example, early on in the War on Terror, we had the authorization for the use of military force, essentially treating the whole world as a battlefield. The original manifestation of the Muslim Registry, which was the National Special Entry-Exit Registration System. The Patriot Act, including material support for terrorism laws, which many of you may have heard of, which have deeply criminalized Muslims and especially around charitable giving. Guantanamo Bay. To me, Guantanamo Bay is one of the most egregious manifestations of institutionalized Islamophobia. Every single prisoner that has been housed in Guantanamo Bay is Muslim. Many of those who ended up in Guantanamo Bay were never charged, and when they were released post-detention and torture, they have received no meaningful compensation, nor an acknowledgement of any sort of wrongdoing. Then there's the kill list, or in euphemistic terms called the Disposition Matrix. For those of you who have read the book Dirty Wars, you may have heard about this, where President Obama essentially was given a list of individuals who fit some sort of profile very broadly and loosely defined of who a terrorist was. Muslims, of course, and Muslims in other countries. He would then order an extrajudicial assassination of these individuals. Now, I'm not exactly entirely sure where this policy stands under Trump, but I imagine it will only be continued and perhaps continue in much more destructive ways. Countering violent extremism. Sue Udry is going to talk extensively about this topic, but one thing I think is especially problematic about this discourse and this policy is the fact that the government has sort of used this narrative of we're empowering Muslim communities to face the threat of violent extremism in their community. Now, in my mind, a government cannot empower a community to address a problem that they determined was the problem. The Muslim community has not determined that violent extremism is a problem within their own community. If the Muslim community had been surveyed, or is surveyed, I highly doubt that they would determine violent extremism to be a problem within their own communities. And this is actually supported by empirical data. Torture. Many of you have probably heard about the use of torture, not only limited to Guantanamo Bay, CIA black sites, Bagram, and the list goes on and on and on. And under the Bush administration, former Attorney General John Yoo narrowed the definition of torture such that torture was only torture if it rose to the level of organ failure or death. So in other words, anything that fell short of that was not to be considered torture. And this is the type of treatment that has been inflicted upon Muslims. And then, of course, most recently, the Muslim ban, both the first version and the second version, right? Almost exclusively focused on Muslims, and buttressed by the fact that Donald Trump talked about the fact that he intended to ban Muslims from this country. So let me tell you what my definition of Islamophobia is. And if you've done any research on this, you probably know that there's probably 200 definitions on Islamophobia. So it's a complex phenomenon, and it's something that people are trying to really understand what the source of it is and where it really comes from. So here's what I have conceptualized Islamophobia as. So Islamophobia is a phenomenon meant to articulate contrived hate of Muslims that is built into structures of the state and society for the pursuit of power and the justification of war and repression. Islamophobia is based on the social construction of Islam as violent, barbaric, uncivilized, and opposed to normative democratic values. Islamophobia positions Muslims as existing outside of moral boundaries extended to other communities, such that their dehumanization results in consequences ranging from prejudice to discrimination, detention, and even death. Intersectional identities of Muslims along various racial, ethnic, cultural, and linguistic lines make the source of Islamophobia difficult to distinctly isolate. However, Islamophobia represents a particular type of oppression as it operates at the nexus of anti-religious animus, racism, cultural racism, nationalism, and xenophobia. Islamophobia is maintained and perpetuated by white supremacy, which upholds notions of dichotomous ideological values between the West and Islam. So I appreciate that this is an extremely long definition, but given the vast number of definitions on Islamophobia, I wanted to really think about what it means and what we are trying to articulate. And also the fact that there are other terms that are being used to describe what we're seeing as sort of this abuse of Muslims. So whether it's anti-Muslim racism, Islamophobia, there are various other terms, really thinking about what it is that we're trying to articulate and using that definition to understand then what are the necessary and important interventions. So that we can just imagine what institutional Islamophobia is, right? The idea of institutional Islamophobia is that these ideas, perceptions, representations, and images of Muslims are deeply embedded into the policies and laws that have been implemented post 9/11 and even beforehand, right? But especially after 9/11 is where we have seen sort of this deeply rooted Islamophobia. I gave you numerous examples of how this has been manifested. And the Muslim ban 1 and 2 gives us other examples, right, from which to draw on and from which to think about how it's deeply manifested in the policies and laws of this country. So on the interpersonal level, what is the connection between the interpersonal Islamophobia and institutional Islamophobia? One of the manifestations of interpersonal Islamophobia are hate crimes, right? We often think about hate crimes as sort of operating distinctly from the policies of the state. But based on the research that I've done and sort of my analysis, I think that it's the state that very much sets the precedent for the ways in which certain target groups can and should be treated, and what will happen if you treat X target group in a specific way. Namely, with the Muslim community, that there won't be any accountability. That sends a message to society that if it's okay for the state to target and demonize and dehumanize a particular group of people, it sends a cue to society that it's also okay for you to enact violence on the societal and interpersonal level. So it's important that we don't see institutional and interpersonal Islamophobia as operating in distinct spheres, and rather that we see them operating in conjunction with one another. Now, after 2001, the year of 2001, the number of hate crimes towards Muslims was at 481. 481 incidences of hate crimes towards Muslims. Thereafter, and up until 2014, which is where the data ends really, the number never went down to below 100. This was a distinct difference from before 2001, in which the number of hate crimes sort of hovered above the 20s, late 20s and 30s. Now we can imagine when the data comes out about 2015, 2016, and subsequent years in which President Trump is in power, we can imagine that perhaps these numbers would increase. But again, what I really want to emphasize is the fact that they operate in conjunction with one another. I think another important thing to emphasize about hate crimes is the fact that it's often the FBI that is responsible for responding to hate crimes. The FBI is also the institution and agency that perpetuates much of the violence towards Muslims. Now, I used to work in an organization where we served prisoners and families, many of whom were targeted by FBI informants. These were cases where an FBI informant was sent out into communities to provoke vulnerable Muslim individuals into committing acts of violence. So, it's really troubling to me that the same institution that is supposed to be responding to hate crimes, again, is enacting acts of violence in the same communities. How then is the Muslim community supposed to trust such an agency and organization? And keep in mind the FBI has a very problematic legacy with marginalized communities in the United States anyway. So it's important to think about how, again, we're responding to hate crimes, how we're responding to institutional violence. So I'm not going to talk much longer because I know that my fellow panelists have a lot of important information to share. But when we think about interventions, particularly on the societal level, I think that there are a number of ways we can think about how to intervene in situations where Islamophobia is manifested. One thing I think is particularly important is focusing on the narrative, right? So when the first Muslim ban came out, a lot of people were saying, well, you know, the people who come from the countries that have been banned have never enacted an act of violence in the United States. So in other words, we weren't rejecting the principle of collective responsibility. We were just talking about the fact that these individuals weren't responsible for an act of violence. So then what happens if there is an individual from a banned country who does commit an act of violence? Does that then give us the license to hold the rest of the country and the citizens within those countries collectively responsible? Absolutely not. So it's these kind of nuances in the narrative that we have to make sure to shift. Another example I think is really important is when the Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture came out, there was a poll in which they asked, you know, basically, do you consider what happened to these CIA suspects as torture? A large portion of the population said yes, it's torture. The subsequent question was, is it justified or not justified? Over 50% said it was justified. So never mind if it's humane, if it's legal, if it's ethical, if it's moral. Muslims only exist in security terms. So our humanity doesn't really matter. It's no longer a question if this type of treatment can be sanctioned, this type of treatment is legal, moral, or ethical. It only matters if there's a security value that can come out of mistreatment and abuse of Muslims. A second thing I think is really important, especially among white audiences, is to do a lot of the work of dismantling white supremacy internally. This is something we've been very active on with the DC Justice for Muslims Coalition. We have some amazing allies, including Jewish Voice for Peace, who've been active in really doing allyship trainings and looking at the ways that Islamophobia specifically is a manifestation of white supremacy. And third, I think just keeping up the pressure. So one thing we've done as well is to organize numerous protests, rallies, and direct actions outside of specific sites like Customs and Border Protection, right? To show the US government, again, that we know what's happening, that we will be there, we will show up and voice our opposition, and that there is a strong community who opposes what the US government has done to criminalize and target Muslims. So I will end there, but thank you very much, and I look forward to questions.